He spent 15 years destroying people's faith with his words. A celebrated investigative reporter who built his career on facts, evidence, and cold, hard truth. He publicly mocked believers, wrote articles dismissing heaven as fantasy, and laughed at anyone who claimed to have seen the other side. To him, death was simply the end of final, permanent blackout. But on an ordinary Tuesday morning, his heart stopped beating for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. And what happened during those minutes would shatter everything he thought he knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. Because the man who died an atheist met Jesus face to face. What he saw in those precious moments between life and death left doctors speechless. The visions he brought back were so vivid, so impossibly detailed, that even his most skeptical colleagues couldn't explain them away. And when he finally opened his eyes in that hospital bed, he was no longer the same person. This is the story of a man who spent his entire life searching for truth in all the wrong places until truth found him in the most terrifying, beautiful way imaginable. A story that will make you question everything you think you know about what happens when we die. Are you ready to hear what he saw on the other side? For 15 years, he'd built his reputation on facts, evidence, and what could be proven. As an investigative reporter for one of the largest newspapers in the country, he'd exposed corruption, interviewed world leaders, and won awards that decorated his office walls. But there was one story he refused to cover, anything involving faith, religion, or the supernatural. To him, these were fairy tales for the weak-minded. He'd grown up without religion. His parents were academics who taught him to trust only in science and reason. Heaven, an ancient comfort mechanism. God, a crutch for those afraid of the dark. He'd even written opinion pieces mocking near-death experiences, calling them hallucinations of an oxygen-deprived brain. His colleagues knew not to mention church or spirituality around him. At dinner parties, he'd confidently dismantle any religious argument with the precision of a surgeon. His atheism wasn't passive, it was militant, intellectual, and absolute. Death, to him, was simply the end. Nothing more, nothing less. But the universe had other plans. It happened on a Tuesday morning, ordinary as any other. He was at his desk, typing furiously to meet a deadline when the first wave hit. A crushing pressure in his chest, like an elephant standing on his ribcage. His left arm went numb. The fluorescent lights above seemed to pulse and dim. "I think I'm having a heart attack," he managed to gasp to a colleague before collapsing to the floor. The office erupted into chaos. Someone called 911, someone else started CPR, but he was barely aware of it. The pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a burning, tearing sensation that made him want to claw out of his own skin. He was 42, in decent shape, with no history of heart problems. This wasn't supposed to happen. In the ambulance, as paramedics worked frantically over him, he felt himself slipping away. The beeping of monitors became distant, like hearing sound underwater. The faces of the EMTs blurred, and then there was nothing. No pain, no sound. Just darkness. He was dead for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. What happened next would shatter every belief he'd held for his entire life. He found himself standing, though he had no body in the traditional sense. He was awareness, consciousness, but somehow complete. The darkness began to lift, replaced by something he still struggles to put into words. A light, yes, but not like sunlight or electricity. This light had weight, presence, personality. It radiated warmth and an overwhelming sense of ... home, and then he appeared. The figure stood before him, and though no words were spoken initially, he knew exactly who this was. Jesus. Not the pale European version from Renaissance paintings, but a presence so powerful, so filled with love, that he fell to what would have been his knees. "I don't believe in you," he tried to say, but the thought felt absurd even as he formed it. He was standing in front of the being he denied his entire life. The response came not in words, but in feeling, a communication that bypassed language entirely. "I know, but I've always believed in you." That single moment of unconditional love broke something in him. All his arguments, his logic, his carefully constructed worldview, it crumbled like sand. Tears he couldn't physically cry streamed down a face he no longer had. Jesus extended what appeared to be a hand, and when he took it, they began to move. Not walking, but traveling through dimensions of existence he'd never imagined. The darkness gave way to colors that don't exist in human perception, sounds that were somehow visible, emotions that had texture and taste. And then he saw it, heaven. But it wasn't clouds and harps. It was more real than anything he'd experienced on Earth. Vast crystalline structures that sang with harmony. Fields of light that shifted and danced. And the people countless souls, each radiating their own unique brilliance, yet all connected in a symphony of unity. What struck him most was the absolute absence of the darkness he'd carried all his life. The cynicism, the anger, the need to be right, it was all gone. Here, there was only truth, beauty, and a love so profound it seemed to be the fabric of reality itself. Jesus showed him scenes from his life, not to judge, but to illuminate. He saw the moments when he'd hurt others with his words, the times he'd crushed someone's faith with his intellectual arrogance. But he also saw something stunning. Even in his disbelief, even in his mockery, he'd been loved. Every single moment, loved without condition. You've spent your life searching for truth, Jesus communicated to him. Now you've found it. But it's not time for you to stay. The transition back was violent and painful. Like being ripped from paradise and thrown into a meat grinder. His body convulsed on the hospital bed. Doctors who'd been preparing to call time of death jumped back in shock as his heart monitor erupted into frantic beeping. He sucked in air like a drowning man breaking the surface. The fluorescent lights were blinding. The sounds machines, voices, footsteps were harsh and chaotic after the perfect harmony he'd just experienced. His chest was on fire where they'd performed CPR and used the defibrillator. But more painful than any physical sensation was the separation. He'd been home, truly home, and now he was back in exile. He began to sob deep, wrenching cries that alarmed the medical staff. How could he explain that these weren't tears of relief, but tears of loss? A cardiologist leaned over him. "Sir, you're incredibly lucky. We got you back. You're going to be okay." But he wasn't okay. Nothing would ever be okay again, or rather, nothing would ever be the same. He'd been transformed at the most fundamental level. The man who died on that ambulance gurney was not the same man who returned. The recovery was slow, but the real challenge wasn't physical. It was integrating what he'd experienced into his everyday life. How do you explain to your secular friends that you met Jesus? How do you tell your editor that you need to completely change the direction of your career? At first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hallucination, a neurological event. He researched everything about near-death experiences, reading the same scientific papers he'd once used to debunk them. But his heart, the same heart that had stopped, knew the truth. This wasn't a trick of neurology. This was real. More real than anything else he'd ever experienced. 3 months later, he resigned from the newspaper. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. His friends staged an intervention, convinced he'd had some kind of psychological break. But he knew what he had to do. Today, he writes and speaks about his experience. Not to convert or preach, but to share what he knows to be true. The skeptic who once mocked faith now dedicates his life to telling others about the love that never gave up on him, even when he'd completely given up on it. He still uses his reporter's instincts, investigating, questioning, seeking truth. But now he knows that the greatest story he'll ever tell isn't one he uncovered through research or interviews. It's the story of the 3 minutes and 47 seconds when he died and discovered that death is not the end. It's the beginning. His message is simple. You don't have to believe for God to be real. You don't have to have faith for you to be loved. And you don't have to wait until you die to start living with purpose. Because on the other side of this life, there's a light waiting. And that light has been calling your name since before you were born. If you've made it this far in this story, it's because it somehow touched you. That's why I'd like to ask you to leave a like and comment below if you've ever experienced something like this or know someone who has. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, as this is very important so you don't miss out on any of the stories told here. A card should already be appearing for you to click on another story. Click there and start discovering another intriguing story about when death arrives, but it's not the end.